You know, I don't know a lot about aliens, to tell you the truth. I do know a lot about marine biology, though. Did anybody notice the sea life that was down there? Did you see a crab? And it came out of the guy's mouth. That's the only one I saw, too. Sorry? Did you see, you know, I saw that. I don't think those were crinoids. I think that was debris field when they were walking across back to, I was wondering. I hadn't noticed anything before. I was looking really carefully this time. Could have been. There was some radially symmetrical something on the sea floor. Well, James Cameron's actually made a few different deep sea movies. He made one in 2005 called Aliens of the Deep. Did anybody see that? It was a documentary showed in IMAXs. I actually was one of the consultants for that movie. I had the pleasure of introducing him at a premiere in San Francisco. And it was actually about animals that live in the deep sea. He's also, of course, did the challenge into Challenger Deep. You guys may have heard about that in the last year, dove to the deepest point on the sea floor. So I don't know much about aliens. I'm glad to take questions on anything, but I thought what I might do is tell you a little bit about what it takes to live in the deep sea. And I've actually got a couple of clips from his Aliens of the Deep as well. So, do you think there should have been life down there? Is that an inhospitable environment, the deep sea? You know, we all think of it as being a very inhospitable environment. We think of it as being an extreme environment, right? No light, not much food, low temperature, high pressure, a really hard place for life to exist. But in fact, most of those are pretty easy challenges to overcome. I mean, the low light, limited food, low temperature, there's lots of places on Earth like that with plenty of life. The high pressure is the one that we really have a hard time relating to, I think. But in fact, it turns out, evolutionarily speaking, adapting to high pressure really isn't that big of a thing. Your membranes don't work quite right, so if you change the lipids in your membranes, they work just fine. Your proteins, your enzymes get a little out of whack. Some go a little faster, some go a little slower. But small changes in your proteins and your enzymes will function just fine. So it's really just a few small changes to get there. And in fact, evolutionarily speaking, lots of animals have done it. In fact, in many ways, the deep sea is a more hospitable environment than, let's say, Rochester, right? Constant darkness, constant pressure, constant temperature, constant chemistry, constant humidity. No night, day, hot, cold, wet, dry, freezing one day, and then like spring the next. So biologically speaking, kind of adapting to the deep sea can be a lot easier. And lots of animals have done it. Ones that I think you'll recognize if you've ever looked in the intertidal or dove shallow. You know, different kinds of crabs, different kinds of anemones, animals that are different species, but you'll usually recognize the group. You know, that's a Dumbo octopus, which I'll maybe show some more at the end. Now, some of the animals you see down there are really fundamentally weird. You know, you look at them and you really can't tell what they are. Does anybody have any idea what that is? What kind of animal? Any guesses? Does anybody know it? It's what most people think. Yep. Does anybody know what a sea cucumber is? Okay, this is first cousin to a starfish. It's a swimming pelagic sea cucumber. That thing swims around, settles onto the ground, eats dirt, gets real heavy, digests any goodies in the dirt, poops out all the heavy stuff, jumps up, floats around, swims somewhere else, and tries again. Well, how do you know what's what? Well, you got to get the samples up from the seafloor. Now, this was one of the things about the movie that I have to admit, let's say was a source of enjoyment when I was watching with a number of other deep sea people that have spent times in submarines and working on the seafloor. Those little buzzing around bumper car submarines making their sharp turns and going 5-6 knots and fast reacting. Things are usually moving a little more slowly. Now this is an ROV pilot sitting on the surface trying to catch this thing with his manipulator. You can picture, I mean, these are guys that grew up playing video games. They're really, really good at it. But it's not easy down there. But you get an appreciation for just how good these pilots are. He's flying the ROV with one hand and working the manipulator with his other hand. So he's going to cruise around and get into position here. Patience is what it takes to work in the deep sea. You really don't get the bumper car move fast effect too much. But these guys are good. Lots of practice, grew up doing it, and bingo. Huh? So that's how we can tell what these animals are. We get the samples up, look at their DNA, and it turns out that they are closely related to their same animal groups we find in much shallower water. And evolutionarily speaking, the deep sea has been invaded hundreds, if not thousands of times by different animal groups. Crabs, lobsters, shrimp, snails, clams, mussels, all kinds of animals closely related to what you see on the surface of the planet. It's really not that extreme of an environment, biologically speaking. Now, of course, for those of us that aren't adapted to it, it's pretty extreme. Now, the lack of life down there, yeah, most of the deep sea, there's not a lot of life, but when you get on a wall like that, where you got good water flow past it, that's coral habitat. And I had the pleasure of diving on the Florida escarpment, not too far away from where this movie took place in the Cayman Trough just this last year, using the Nautilus submarine, Bob Ballard's submarine, the Hercules on his ship, the Nautilus. We're at 7,500 feet, 7,500 feet here. And what you see on an average escarpment are scenes like this. It's really lush with corals that are taking advantage of the currents going by. That's our camera out in front, the Beast Cam, which takes really beautiful pictures of a very colorful and diverse array of corals and all kinds of little friends, shrimps and other things. But these are kind of normal animals. Now, Jim Cameron's movie, The Aliens of the Deep, was about animals that live in a different environment, which really is pretty extreme. There's places on the sea floor where the plates that make up the surface of the planet are spreading apart. Hot water is coming out of the sea floor. The temperature of the water in that black smoker is 400 degrees centigrade. The only reason it's not boiling is the pressure is keeping it from boiling. That what looks like black smoke are the minerals dissolved in that water from the center of the earth that are precipitating out when it hits the cold seawater. And there's animals down there like the picture in the middle, those tube worms, middle bottom. That animal lives its whole life with its attached to the seafloor in water that's 30 degrees and its plumes sticking up into water that's 2 degrees. It's like living your life with one end of your body in a hot tub and the other end of your body in ice water. Okay, 30 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees centigrade. Really some strange life. That animal also has no mouth, no gut, no anus, gets its energy from the dissolved, reduced chemicals that are coming up from the center of the earth. This, in fact, is a clip from his film where he was filming these tube worms on the East Pacific Rise. Worms that are 3 feet long, and a biomass that's living in these environments that's similar to what you would see in any ecosystem on Earth, the same kind of biomass you'd see on a coral reef or a tropical rainforest. Crabs, similar to what you've seen, giant mussels and these giant mouthless, gutless tube worms. If you go to other places in the mid-ocean ridge system, this is in the mid-Atlantic, you find completely different animals. And this is another really amazing animal living at hot vents, again, in hot water. This is a shrimp that no longer has eyes. It has bacteria that reap the energy in that hot water that it can feed on. The bacteria live in its carapace. It kind of munches on them with its feet. And it gives the bacteria the energy they need by swimming in and out of this energy-rich water. So how can it stay in that environment? Well, this little shrimp has evolved something better than eyes. The nerve endings that used to go to its eyes now go to eye spots on its back, and it can detect the light emanating from a hydrothermal vent at 2 miles deep. Truly a strange adaptation in a shrimp. So there are some pretty strange animals down there. There are some aliens of the deep, but also a lot of life in general, and a lot of life that's a lot more normal. So that's all that I wanted to say to you, but I'd love to take some questions. Yeah? Sure. So the question is, what's the nutrient source for the animals that you see on the bottom of the ocean? So in most of the deep sea, the nutrient source is surface primary productivity. It's the little bit that falls from the surface and makes it all the way down. It can be remains. If it's a whale fall, it's that's a lot of nutrients for animals in that immediate environment. But in general, it's low-density animals because not a lot makes it down there. Places like walls, where there's good currents bringing a lot of food by, you can get a lot more growth. The temperature's a lot lower. At those kind of places, it's 2 degrees centigrade. The animals tend to have low metabolic rates and live a really long time. Some of those corals can be 500 and more years old. Now, a hydrothermal vent's completely different. In those areas, the energy source are reduced chemicals. There's bacteria down there that can harness the energy in those chemicals with a process called chemoautotrophy, which is, by the way, closely related to photoautotrophy. You all know what that is? That's another word for photosynthesis. That's green plants harvesting the energy in sunlight, using that to fix carbon, turn it into food, and we all eat it. Well, the bacteria down there can harvest the energy in reduced chemicals, take that energy to fix carbon and make food that everything else down there eats. So that's why you can find so much life at a vent. Other places, not so much. Yes?
What's the soil surface down there? I imagine it's all mucky and muddy?
Mucky and muddy is a very good description of most of the deep sea. Yeah. There's exceptions to that, of course. So hydrothermal vents is one, because you have new seafloor being made by, these are volcanic spreading centers, so it's lava is the source down there. In the Gulf of Mexico, you have carbonates that form around seeps, so you can have rocks. Where you have escarpments and very serious geological features, that muck is washed away, if you will. But in most of the deep sea, in the abyssal plain, it's millions of years of fish poop and dead animals and dead plants. So yeah, muck. Yes, ma'am.
The tube worms looked as if they had an outer, possibly calcareous tube, and then that bloody red thing that moved a little.
Yeah.
Do I have that sort of right?
You do have that sort of right. So the plume that's sticking out, that dark red bloody plume, is red because of hemoglobin. That is basically their gill. And they use that to take up the dissolved chemicals that they use for energy. They can actually take up sulfide and oxygen with that gill. Now the tube they live in, it is an outer tube. It's non-living, it's not calcareous. It's more parchment-like. It's a proteinaceous type of tube. So it can be pretty rigid, but it's not brittle like calcium carbonate. In the very back, I see a hand. Do I have an opinion on climate change and its effect on the oceans? So, yes, there are some aspects of the climate change that where the record in the ocean is absolutely undeniable, even by people who don't understand statistics and think a snowball outside of the House of Representatives is a good sign that climate change is not going on. And what that signal is in the ocean is ocean acidification. If you look at the pH of the ocean over the last thousands of years, it's varied just a little bit up and down, a few tenths. And then starting with the Industrial Revolution and accelerating now, it is dropped precipitously. So we are now several pH units more acidic than the ocean has ever been in any records that we can untangle from various proxies for ocean pH over time, and it's dropping, and that's due to excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's hard to deny where that carbon dioxide is coming from. It's anthropogenic activity from the Industrial Revolution through now. So that's a major effect. It's going to affect calcification. It's going to affect coral reefs. It's going to affect animals that can't tolerate temperature change. Then we have the temperature change itself, which has already started to affect coral reefs. We've already lost somewhere between a third and half of the coral reefs on the planet have been seriously and deleteriously impacted. My opinion is that we're going to see the loss of most of the coral reefs on the planet during our children's lifetime, which is a scary thought.
Did you say several pH
S-
units?
No, I'm sorry, several tenths of a pH unit, several tenths. But very, very easily measurable and detectable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So the question is, what's the source of oxygen in the bottom waters? And it's actually from just ocean circulation. So the oceanic bottom waters are coming up from the poles where they've chilled and sunk and then are circulating. The cycling time for oceanic waters on the scale of a couple of thousand years. So the oxygen levels are lower in the deep sea, but you still have enough turnover and enough circulation that you're at about half saturation at most places in the deep sea. Now there are areas where there's oxygen minimum zones. There's areas in the Gulf of Mexico where we have dead zones due to a lot more animal activity. But in general, you're at about half of saturation on the seafloor. So in general, there's plenty of oxygen. There's no oxygen in that water coming up at hydrothermal vents. That's completely anaerobic. But the animals live in a mixing zone where they can get a little bit. Yes, I see another hand in the back.
What's the largest moving creature that's down?
What's
They get very large.
the largest moving creature that's down there? Well, it depends on how far down you go. So I think probably giant squid are going to be one of the deeper divers. When I was doing a little bit of preparation for tonight, did a little Googling and this and that, I was trying to figure out what the deepest diving mammal was. And there is a beaked whale that's been clocked going down to, I believe it's 10,000 feet, almost 9,000 some odd feet. The biggest one I've seen on the seafloor are some large sharks. We've seen swordfish at 500-600 meters, so that's almost 2,000 feet, and some very large siphonophores, very long invertebrates related to jellyfish. Yes, sir.
Let's address the movie a little bit.
Okay.
Other than the obviously miraculous, were there some problems with the science in the movie?
So let's see. One of the questions that I got, I actually did a little short radio interview with your local station here last week, and they asked about breathing liquid. So I did a little research into that, and one of the amazing things I found out is the scene in the movie where they submerged the rat into the oxygenated fluorocarbons was real. They really submerged a rat, and the rat can breathe. So that's true. That technology, I guess, is now being used in some to maintain very premature babies that aren't yet ready to breathe air, but has not yet, although there's a dive suit that's been designed, it hasn't been used by people. There are a couple of times where the relationship between inside pressure and outside pressure are a little bit weird, where you've got the submarines are actually at bottom pressure, which means a leak wouldn't necessarily flood into the submarine unless, the air is going out high. You need two leaks, one low and one high. But basically, I think I mentioned that the submarines move a little fast. Things just don't move that fast and turn that sharp, that deep underwater. It's hard for me to imagine a submarine with enough power to actually pull that rig. You know, that rig is hanging down. You got the weight of the cable, the weight of the rig. It was being dragged by the ship when you move it. We do try to do that. It's ROVs that are attached to a cable, and they, you know, you can try to drag your cable around with the ROV, and you really can't even get enough power to go more than a couple of meters from directly below the ship. So there's technological ways to do that. But how about, did you have some ideas? Because I'm really not an engineer, so I'm sure there were things that I didn't catch, but.
Well, I know that the drowning of the woman
Yeah.
could take place in that way with the low temperatures and suspended animation for, well, several, I've read of several instances, like 20 minutes, half an hour, where
Yeah.
someone was able to be revived.
Yeah. Well, you know, when we bring up deep sea animals to work with them on the surface, if we keep them cold, ice cold, so we shut them into a box at bottom pressures, bring them up, even if they stop functioning because of the change in pressure, heart stops beating, nerves aren't working very well, if we repressurize them quickly without them getting warm, we can bring them back up and keep them alive for months. So they can actually stand the decompression because they don't have any air spaces. They can stand the decompression if we keep them cold and recompress them. Now, there are other air spaces in the human body that, you know, that might have been a little bit of a stretch there, and one of them's in your eyes. And it's air spaces that are a real problem, you know, with decompression. Have you ever been deep sea fishing, brought up a fish with a swim bladder, and when he reaches the surface, the swim bladders come out of his mouth because it's expanded. Air expands and contracts. Water, not so much. You know, tiny, tiny fractions of a percent, even with all that pressure. Back row again, and then we'll come up here.
Could you talk about some of your role models, like what influenced you to get into the field?
So the question was, what are my role models that influenced me to get into the field? So that's an interesting question because my mother and father were musicians. I was born and raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I went on a spring break. I thought I was going to be either a mathematician or a lawyer when I went to college. I went to spring break in Jamaica, and I went snorkeling for the first time. And I said, I want to get paid to do this. And that's how it started. And so I came back, got inspired, brought my grades up, went to graduate school in Santa Barbara, working on coral reefs, and hydrothermal vents were discovered, and those strange animals, those tube worms, were discovered while I was a grad student. And I went and started working on those, did that as a postdoc, and have stuck with it ever since. So I'm not, you know, I guess I didn't have a role model in the classic sense. You know, I loved Jacques Cousteau then, but yes.
I don't know anything about diving. Can you talk to us about diving? Can you really, when they were at the bottom, they didn't have a suit and they
Yeah.
to the next
Yeah.
portal?
So, I mean, I think that part is technically possible. They were equilibrated. That really wasn't that deep, right? It was less than a couple of thousand feet. You know, I don't usually turn on the lights to the submarine until I get down at least that far. So scuba diving, you can go down kind of routinely, 100 feet. I think the scuba diving record may be a few hundred feet. The compressed air record without, you know, as a free dive up and down is about 600 feet. And I think the guy spent 12 hours, you know, 15 minutes going down and 12 hours coming back up. Then after that, it's different kinds of special gas mixes, nitrox mixes. In this movie, they were using, I think, helium was the mix. They didn't have nitrogen narcosis, but they had this other nervous disorder that I think is more a function of just your nerves not working correctly under pressure, membranes not working well. But diving itself, it's easy. You should try it. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about bioluminescence?
Okay.
Because I'm curious about that. Did you see some of the deeper sea
Yeah.
creatures have this bioluminescence to them and how that's exactly produced?
So the question was about bioluminescence and how it's produced. So bioluminescence is produced basically in several different ways. There are animals that produce it themselves. It's an enzymatic reaction, usually involving oxygen, where they're emitting light. Some people have theorized that it was actually evolved originally as a reaction to get rid of excess energy. And one way to get rid of that excess energy in a reaction instead of heat is to release it as light. There are also bacteria that are bioluminescent. And my specialty is symbiosis, which is why I was studying the tube worms. And there are a number of deep sea animals that harbor symbionts for the light that they give off. There's squid that grow symbiotic bioluminescent bacteria in a light organ, and then have little shutters and mirrors to make that light go in different directions and work just right. There are several groups of fish that do the same thing, that emit light. Sometimes they'll emit light as a diffuse glow down at night, so predators beneath them at night can't see a shadow against the moonlight, or deeper down, a shadow against sunlight. So some animals make it as a camouflage. There's deep sea squid that instead of releasing ink to escape, they release a bioluminescent cloud to escape, which in a world of pure darkness is kind of like the equivalent of releasing ink. So there's a lot of different ways it's used. There's animals that use it for intraspecific communication, startle displays. There's deep sea anglerfish that have bacterial symbionts in a little lure that they dangle in front of their face, and when little other fish come to investigate the lure, they gobble them down. So all kinds. It's a great topic. Yes, sir.
What would that octopus be using inside for?
Well, it could be for bioluminescence. Okay, so there are deep sea animals whose eyes are especially sensitive at the wavelengths of bioluminescence. And that's about all you can think of for things that live at that depth. Sometimes animals at that depth will have eyes that are just evolutionary vestiges, you know. Their ancestors had them, and the eyes can be more or less functional. But I don't really know the biology of that octopus very well, although I was on a dive when the first specimen of the Dumbo octopus ever was collected. It was kind of interesting. You guys want to hear a short story? So I'm in the Alvin submarine. I was a graduate student, but leading the dive because it was our dive, and I had a very senior French scientist down in the Alvin with me. And we saw this Dumbo octopus. And he said, "Oh, we must collect the octopus. It's never been collected before." I said, "No. You know, my boss wrote the grant to have us down here. That bio box is for tube worms. We have to collect tube worms on our dive today. We've got experiments planned, dissections to do. We're collecting tube worms, and we're fighting back and forth. I felt like it was an international incident brewing. So I said, "Okay, Danielle, we'll try to collect the octopus," because I'm thinking, no way are we going to catch an octopus with a submarine moving in slow motion. Okay? So I told the pilot, "Pat, go ahead, give it a try." He opens the lid to the bio box in the front of the submarine, walked up to the octopus and poked it, and just like I expected, the octopus took off, did a backflip, landed in the bio box. And they closed the lid, and we brought it to the surface. Somewhat fortuitous. I was in trouble when we reached the surface, by the way, for not bringing back tube worms in that temperature-insulated bio box. Yes?
I really get seasick. You get seasick in a submarine.
You know, you don't, except for during launch and recovery. So a submarine, when they first put it in the water, you stay on the surface for a little bit, checking everything out, making sure everything's good to dive, and you're bobbing like a cork. And so if you're out there and it's a little bit rough and you're not feeling well, those first couple of minutes can be evil in a submarine, because the last thing you want to do is to throw up in a 6-foot sphere that you're about to spend the next 8 hours in, and the people with you don't like that too much either. So no, you don't usually get seasick in a submarine, but you can feel like it. Once you go down, it's smooth. Then it's just no motion at all.
Hector,
Yes?
is there life all the way down to these deep? Or can you get down far enough where there's
So the question is there life all the way to the bottom of the ocean? And the answer is yes, there most certainly is. There, fish, I believe it's 7,000, so about 20,000 feet is the deepest that anybody has ever recorded fish. Now that doesn't mean that they're not down there, because we don't spend a lot of time deeper than 7,000 feet. But with traps and different ways of bringing them up and observations, nobody's ever recorded a fish deeper than that. And of course the ocean goes down to a little better than 11,000 meters. There are invertebrates down there, most certainly. There are coral types of animals and worms and other forms of, metazoan life, regular animals with brains and hearts and all that kind of stuff. Yes?
So there was this odd-looking shark that I believe washed up in around Australia that was from the deep, and it was very white, which to me indicated it might be from fairly deep area of living. And it's one that, not that I'm a shark expert, but one that I've never seen, and it was very, very odd and looking. Are you familiar with that? And why would something like that wash up? Because I guess it was dead when it was caught.
Yeah.
Just go down.
So the answer to your question is no, I'm not familiar with that. But the question was about a shark that washed up on shore in Australia that was very strange looking, deep living shark in white. And yes, that it does make sense that if it's white that it may be from deep, lack of pigment. Most of the colors in animals at that depth are not made by the animal to be colorful, like a bird or something on the surface, because there's no light for anybody to see the color. As to why it would wash up, if it was at a moderate depth and it started to decompose, and moderate depths, you can still have no light. You can still be deep sea, for all practical purposes. And by moderate depths, I mean like 1,000 feet. A little bit of light might make it down there, but not much. And decomposition can produce gas. And so you could have had gas that was trapped and made it a little buoyant, I'm guessing. A lot of the animals and fish that live at any depth try to stay neutrally buoyant, so they're not far away from drifting up or down. They don't want to spend energy fighting to stay down or fighting to stay off the bottom. So most of those animals are really close to being neutrally buoyant. Anybody else? Yes. It was a frilled shark. Oh, that, by the way, is my wife, who I was wondering what she was. I was a little scared to call on her. Jenny, who she's a vet, but did do some work in the deep sea as well, and has made one alvin dive, although she fell asleep on the seafloor for part of it. But thank you, Jenny.
What was the question?
The question was what kind of shark, and I'm guessing she's back there on her cell phone, and she Googled it and found out that it was a frilled shark that washed up in Australia. And I don't know what that is, so I still can't help you.
It had this nose, this beak that came way out, its mouth was way under, and
Wow.
it had teeth growing out. And like you saw their eyes are what appeared to be visual appendages.
So it had eyes. Yeah.
But it was, again, I'm not a shark expert, but it was almost like, those almost were unnecessary, it was just odd.
There are, some of the evolutionary dances, some of the, the variations on a theme that you find in deep sea animals are really crazy. They really are. There are some strange creatures down there.
What do you think is the next newest thing that they're studying in the ocean biologically?
What's the next newest thing that you will be studying in the ocean? Boy, that's a really tough question because it's hard to guess what the next discovery will be. You know, I don't really know where to start. There's a lot of exploration going on right now. There are ridge systems in the high latitudes and near the poles that are virtually unexplored. So I'm sure we'll be finding some new animal life down there. More and more we are mining different life forms for enzymes of different types that may be, I work in the Gulf of Mexico. I've been working on animals living around oil seeps. And there's a lot of enzymes in those animals that may help us deal with oil remediation, for example, or things like that. But I don't know the answer to your question. Do you have some ideas?
No, I don't. I just wondered, I don't know very much about the field, and I wondered what's
Well,
targeted next.
I can tell you that there's a lot of interest in learning what the life is around manganese nodules at 4,000 meters on the abyssal plain. And the reason for that is that those manganese nodules are being targeted for mining. The International Seabed Authority has issued mining leases, and the hot money is within the next 3 to 4 years, we're going to see mining of those nodules from 4,000 meters for the rare earth elements in them. So there's a big push now to learn more about those habitats and what's down there. Let me take the back, and then I'll come over here. We'll go around and get some. Yes, sir.
One question, do you like seafood, and if so, what kind do you like?
Okay, well, I had a skate wing for dinner tonight at a really nice restaurant in town. Yeah, I do like seafood. I'm partial to crustaceans, lobsters and crabs especially. Dungeness crab's probably my favorite. So, yeah. And I'm a carnivore, but I do raise cows and pigs and chickens, and I eat all those too. Yes, sir.
Said that the pH change is going to affect the coral reefs severely.
Yeah.
What else is going to be affected that we're worried about?
Okay, so the question is, what else could the pH change in the ocean affect? Well, corals are, of course, foundation species for whole communities. So I'm going to start with the corals, just go on the implications of that. If the corals die, the animals that depend on them will die. Corals protect islands and atolls all over the world. If the corals die, then those islands and atolls, not only will their tourist industry die, but their beaches will erode, and in some cases those islands and atolls will disappear, and countries will cease to exist. So a big effect on corals is much more than the corals themselves. It's fisheries and it's cultures and it's countries. But pH also affects the way animals sense. It affects the way that they respond to stimulus. So there's another study that I read about recently where larval fish were unable to hone in on sensory cues with a change of pH of about 0.2 of a pH unit. So I don't know what other effects there might be, but when you change the medium, and when you change pH, you're going to change the structure of chemicals. There are chemicals that are going to be in a different form because of the pH change, and that's going to change the way they act as well as, the way they're sensed. So it won't just be corals.
So that the story really needs to get out. You don't read about that in the newspaper. You read about just the CO2 buildup.
Yeah.
Warming effects, but the whole story.
The ocean acidification story is a big one, and it's one of the things about it that really impresses me, and I completely believe in climate change and the change in the ocean temperature, but I don't understand the statistics. I couldn't generate and analyze the data to prove it the way that these brilliant mathematicians do. But ocean acidification, it doesn't take any fancy statistics. It's a little wobbly line that's just gone like this in the last 150 years. It isn't changing. So, and it is going to be a big effect, unfortunately. And the story does need to get out there. You're absolutely right. So I had someone, you had your hand up again, then I'll come forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to know about the Fukushima power plant disaster
Mm-hmm.
that did,
Yeah.
the radiation
So I don't really know that there have been direct effects of the radiation other than extremely close. Certainly it's been detected all over. But that's something I'm not really very expert on. And I mean, one of the great things and one of the challenges for the ocean is that the solution to pollution is dilution, right? So it can be very diffuse and the effects can be very long term. I've been studying the BP oil spill, and it could have been so much worse. The effects are really limited in the seafloor to an area right around there. But the reason it wasn't worse, even though there were hundreds of millions of gallons spilled, is the dilution factor of the ocean. Yeah. What was the name of the petroleum company in this movie? Does anybody remember? In the Abyss? The initials were BP. I did notice that, but I think that was a coincidence.
The increase in the pH, how is that affecting methane levels in the ocean?
I know of no direct effect on methane levels, and methane doesn't kind of change states with pH the way that CO2, that carbon dioxide does, or sulfide does, or something like that. What will affect methane in the ocean is a change in ocean temperature. So in the ocean, many parts of the ocean, especially in polar areas, we have methane hydrates. This is a form of methane ice that forms under low temperatures and high pressure. I've seen it in the Gulf of Mexico, as shallow as 450, 500 meters depth. And in the Gulf of Mexico, it's living right at the temperature pressure horizon. So, for example, at the sites I work at, when a warm core ring moves through and the water temperature goes up on the seafloor by 2 or 3 degrees, the disassociation of those hydrates goes way up and you get giant bubble streams off the seafloor. So a change in ocean temperature will lead to destabilization of hydrates, which could have a large effect on methane release from the oceans, and especially from polar oceans. Anybody else? We got another one in the back here.
What about, in terms of journalism and science writing, are you, in terms of, when you look at journalists and how they cover science, do you think that there could be better writing about science?
So the question is, in short, do I think that there could be better science journalism than what we find? Well, yes, of course, but it varies widely. There are some really excellent science journalists out there. Some of the writers for the New York Times and the Washington Post, for their science pages are really, really careful, thorough, bright people. And then there's some that are not so much, absolutely. When we've made real newsworthy discoveries, I talked about the methane hydrates. Okay, back 20 years ago, we found these little worms living on the surface of methane ice exposed on the seafloor in the Gulf of Mexico. We nicknamed them ice worms, right? And because methane hydrates, I don't know whether you all realize this, there's more fossil fuel in methane hydrate. There's more buried fuel in methane hydrate than in all of the coal, oil, and gas on the planet combined. Okay, so it's a great potential source for energy. So we found these ice worms, big publicity, lots of journalists, and some great ones and some great articles, but it was when I learned that the dumbest things you say is what you're going to find, reported, sometimes for humor. But I made the mistake of doing an interview for the London Times, which I thought was a good, legitimate newspaper. Well, it turns out once a week it's not so much. It's more like the National Enquirer, and the headlines read, "Discovery of worms boosts hope for life on other planets." Chuck Fisher So, yeah, you get the whole gamut, from very responsible, very bright journalists to sensationalist idiots. All right. Well, you guys are troopers. It's really stayed. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.